I'm Jakob from Gleechi. We're a small startup company coming from Sweden. It's in the northern parts of Europe, very cold country. That's why my forehead is red as a lobster after one day in the Californian sun. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about hand interaction in virtual environments. And the reason why I'm going to talk about that is because we are a startup coming from the field of robotics, and especially making robots able to use their hands to pick things up in real time. And now we're applying this technology to make it possible to see and use your hands in VR, very much as a complement to the things that Johansson are doing. We're not a competitor in any way. So I'm going to share some of the things we have learned coming from the field of robotics, as well as some of the things we have learned from working very focused on hand interaction with different hardware in VR for the latest 2 years. So a bit about our background. We are coming from 8 years of research related to these kind of robots, not only this particular robot, but this is one of the robots that we used to work with. And you have some kind of robot that has some kind of humanoid hand. It can be 3 fingers or 5 fingers. The robot has some kind of sensor, in this case the eyes, that can see the objects around the robot. And the robot has some kind of intention. The robot wants to do something with these different objects. So as you can see here, it's 2 different pictures where the robot kind of grasps things differently depending on what the robot is trying to do. So you're probably going to grasp a mug in a different way if you're going to drink from it compared to if you're going to, put it in a dishwasher or whatever. I don't know why a robot would do that, but so that is kind of where we're coming from. And a lot of people are talking about kind of the robotics revolution just being around the corner. It's definitely not. I mean, it's another 10 years before we can commercialize this kind of software to enable flexible robot hands. But what we realize is that working with robots, controlling a physical robot is very much the same thing as controlling an animated avatar in a game or in virtual reality. So about 2 years ago, we started looking into applying this technology for 3D animation. And that was about the same time as VR started becoming a big thing, and realized that if we had to put in this much effort to make hand interaction work in robotics, it's probably going to be a big problem in VR as well. And back then, this was the kind of typical example of free interaction, hand interaction. So Surgeon Simulator is a fantastic game, but maybe the interaction doesn't look, 100% realistic. I don't know, it's a terrible surgeon. Terrible surgeon, no shit, surgeon. So this was about 2 years ago. And we had this prediction that it's probably going to be a problem with this kind of interaction in the future of VR. And if we fast forward 2 years to today and look at some of the best demos out there in VR, we still see this being a problem. This is a toy box demo from Oculus. And you kind of see how the fingers just go through the objects. They just penetrate straight through them. And we have a bunch of different examples on kind of how this looks in different applications. This is a leap motion game. And this is a very typical problem when you have finger tracking hardware of different sorts, because the fingers tend to just go through the objects because there's no physical objects out in the real world where your hand will stop. For a lot of the motion controllers out there, you often see this kind of interaction where objects kind of pop into your hand magically, just the intended way it's supposed to be. We see this in a drift. It's a little bit more subtle here, but you can see endless amount of examples of this. It just kind of pops into your hand. I think Job Simulator has a very fascinating way of getting around this because they make the objects kind of invisible, or sorry, the hands invisible when you pick it up. But we all see these as different examples of making hand interaction look realistic and natural when you want to interact freely. I relate to this little character here. It's called a homunculus, and it shows how the brain perceives the body. Now, the hands are enormous because they are so extremely complex. And this is something we also see when we come to rigging avatars for games or VR. This is from Mixamo. So if you want the whole body, including the fingers, to move naturally, you need about 65 joints in total. Whereas if you only have 1 joint for the hand, you only need about 25 joints. So you almost triple the amount of moving parts when you include hands. So obviously this becomes a problem. And in 3D animation and in games, we've been trying to avoid using hands. You kind of see these hands glued to a gun when you run around in a shoot 'em up game. One of the reasons why the Simpsons only have 4 fingers is because it takes so much extra time to animate one of these little fat yellow fingers. So obviously this is naturally a problem in VR. And we're in the very starting phase of VR. So that's why we can look at robotics, which has been in this field for 60 years and working with robotics hands. So there definitely is some things that you can learn from there. So I'm going to share about, I think it's 9 different tips from us working from this. And the first one is related to the hardware. So if you look at the evolution of robots, we started out with these kind of simple parallel jaw grippers, very simple kind of robotics hands. And the typical hands that we were working on was these kind of humanoid hands that are more flexible but tend to be less good in terms of performance. Now, the ideal kind of robotics hand that we are aiming for is kind of something of a copy of the human hand. But not even the human hand is as efficient as these kind of simple parallel jaw grippers, in particular tasks, that is. So for manufacturing tasks, these kind of simple things are fantastic because they are fast, they are accurate, they are very good at repeating things. So even though, 60 years has gone since the first robot hand, we still see the same kind of principles today. Now, we think we're going to see a similar pattern in terms of VR, because now in the very beginning, we start with these 6 degrees of freedom motion controllers. We have a button that you click when you're supposed to interact. And then along the way, and a lot of people are talking about the future of VR, is this kind of finger tracking hardware. That is everything from gloves to 3D sensors like U-Sense or Leap Motion that tracks your fingers. Now, I believe that these kind of motion controllers are the standard today because they're very simple to work with. But I also believe that it's not going to be one single hardware input out there because they have different purposes. They are good for different things. For games, the motion controllers are fantastic because they are very developer-friendly. Developers can design kind of interaction based on you interact by clicking a button and then you interact the intended way. Now, this is very user-friendly as well. If you have a shoot-'em-up game and you want to pick up a gun, you don't want to sit there for 10 minutes trying to pick it up the right way, getting your finger through that little hole. You just want to click a button and pick it up. But at the same time, you might want this kind of finger tracking for a lot of applications. We've seen that communication, finger tracking is extremely useful there because body language is so important in our communication. Some of the customer cases we've been working on also demands finger tracking. For example, surgery training or a lot of simulations where you're supposed to simulate an environment because it leads to look and feel natural. So the first thing is choose a controller based on the use case. This is very often what we tell our customer and our partners because you have a bunch of different hardware flooding the market. And generally, we see 3 big trends here that we tend to work with. It's the gloves, the motion controllers, and the 3D sensors. And they all have different advantages and disadvantages. If you want finger tracking, you probably need some kind of 3D sensor or glove. If you need some kind of haptic feedback, you can't have 3D sensors because your fingers are out in the air. But the gloves, on the other hand, are not particularly convenient because you need to kind of get these gloves on. They're different size, and it's a little bit of hassle. So what we keep on telling the people we work with is that, yeah, sure, for games, at the moment, it makes sense to use the motion controllers because that's what a lot of people are going to have in their homes. But a big part of VR is going to be a lot of other applications. Out in, training people in different industries. And it makes sense to actually consider a lot of the other hardware. The second thing, coming from robotics, avoid the Uncanny Valley. This is a concept we talk a lot about in robotics. It's related to, if you design a robot, the more human-like it looks, the more familiar it tends to feel. Until you get to a certain point where it's, when the robot looks fairly human-like, but something is off, you get freaked out. And this is very typical within robotics. It's only the Japanese robots for some reason. I don't know why. And it's kind of these, And it's a little bit fascinating because people really get freaked out by these very human-looking robots. And this is very relevant when working with hands in robotics as well. For prosthetic hands, for example, having very human-like hands can be freaky. So often you have more robotic-looking hands because It's not in this creepy Uncanny Valley. So one of the first things we noticed when we started working with VR was that this very much applies in VR as well. When you have a couple of hands, humanoid hands that you see that are quite human-like but something off, people get kicked out of the feeling of presence. So if you don't have the resources or time to actually make this interaction and the hand look natural, try to stay away from the Uncanny Valley. Go for a more abstract representation of your hand. Have robotics hands, for example. It's much better. The third tip is about avoiding hand personalities, and that's related to when we started working with hands and started testing out our first demos, we had these kind of white male hands, and people with different skin colors often tend to feel like it doesn't feel, there's something weird about it. Not everyone, but a lot of people. And a lot of people who had exceptionally small hands also felt a little bit weirded out about this kind of seeing a couple of normal-sized hands in front of you. So what we discovered was just put a couple of gloves on the hands and people quite quickly get away from this feeling. An even better solution is to have different hands to choose from, but a very easy way is just put gloves on it. So this doesn't apply to everyone, but a lot of people get annoyed by this. So if you want to develop a VR game for everyone, then think about this. Be consistent. And this is a quite fascinating thing that we've been testing a lot. And that is if you have this realistic representation of your hands, if you're on the right side of the Uncanny Valley, because you can get there, then you need to make the interaction look highly natural. When you pick things up, it can't just jump into your hand magically. That's typical presence killer. Whereas if you have more abstract representations of the hand, for example, a robotic hand, people are much more forgiving in terms of how the interaction looks. So you can have stuff kind of jumping into your hand. If you work with finger tracking hardware, transparent hands are fantastic because you often get in a situation where your fingers kind of penetrate objects. In those cases, transparent hands are a fantastic solution. Because if you have solid hands, people also get a little bit like, what's happening? Cartoon hands, as we saw in Job Simulator, that's actually a very good way of handling, making the hands invisible when you pick something up and only seeing the objects floating around representing your hands. On the other hand, this doesn't work very well when you have realistic hands. People felt weird when their hands disappeared, when the environment and their hands looked very realistic. Finally, the absolutely easiest way is to just have kind of the controllers, for example, the HTC Vive controllers, seeing them float around, because then you can have this kind of static interaction and no one cares. So you need to be consistent in this sense. Skip the arms for now, because you tend to get this problem where you only track where your hands are, but you don't know where the elbow is. So the virtual elbow might be a different position from your own. And people get extremely annoyed by this, much more annoyed than seeing just a pair of floating hands. Now, I'm sure that there's going to be a good IK for this in the very near future. We're experimenting with this a lot. But it's enough that you see your arm being off 1 out of 20 times and people get annoyed by it. So for now, we haven't seen any good IKs, so stay away from the arms. It's just a pain. Think long and hard about every object in the scene. You don't want the VR scene to look like this, because in VR, people want to pick up and interact with things. They want to pick up a glass, throw it in the ground, and yeah, people can be quite assholes in VR sometimes. So even though this can be a work in a traditional game, you don't want this kind of scene. Think long and hard about every object, because people are going to want to interact with it. And if you can't interact with things, people get annoyed. Typical presence killer. Make it obvious how to interact with objects. In robotics, we talk a lot about affordances, which is essentially about making obvious what you're supposed to do with an object. So it's a very good thing to put a big handle on something so you understand that you're supposed to pick it up in a particular way. Other ways of working with this is kind of highlighting objects and making it very clear that you're supposed to twist this or pull this one. If it's not obvious for people that they have to kind of try 5 times before making it work, that's extremely annoying. It's not a good experience at all. And especially if you're going for more realistic representation, I personally am not a big fan of this highlighting, highlighting stuff, because it doesn't feel natural. But it works very well when it's a more animated background. Pick the most natural grasp. Now, this might sound very obvious, but we keep on seeing game developers animating these kind of grasp. I grab everything very manly with my hand, power grasp. But this is not how we interact with the world. In robotics, we talk a lot about grasp taxonomy, which essentially illustrates how you tend to interact with different objects depending on the shape and the intention. So have a look at this. It's easy to Google this kind of stuff, grasp taxonomy, and it shows kind of how you usually tend to interact. If you do a pinch grasp or a power grasp or whatever. I think my time is running out, but the last recommendation I have for today is to use feedback. Haptic feedback when picking things up is the absolutely best. If you have some kind of buzzing feeling in the motion controller or the glove, that's the optimal thing. If you have some kind of 3D sensor or you can't do haptic feedback for some reason, you want to do some kind of other feedback. It can be an audio cue. For example, there's a noise when you pick something up. It can be visual clues. For example, that if it's a highlighted object before you grasp it, the highlight disappears. This is very important because this adds a lot to kind of the immersion. So that's pretty much it from me. This is a quick example on, this is quite an old demo. You can see by the terrible hands in the way all the time. But this is when we implement our software in the Tuscany demo from Oculus. Suddenly you can kind of interact with all different objects just based on the mesh data, regardless if you use kind of an Oculus Touch controller, if you have a mouse and click on different parts. So that's essentially what we do. We're trying to make the interaction look very realistic. So if you're interested in kind of using this kind of technology, we are looking into developing a plugin solution for Unity and Unreal. We're not there yet, but if you want to be updated, send me an email, and I can keep you posted. That's it from me today.